Good evening, everyone. Dear subscribers, welcome to a new true horror story. If this is your first time visiting us, I invite you to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any terrifying stories. And to all our faithful followers, thank you for being here one more night. Tonight, I bring you a truly disturbing story sent by one of our bravest subscribers, Jose Luis Hernandez Sanchez, a bus driver by trade who for years has traveled the highways of Mexico. What you're about to hear is his testimony just as he lived it, word for word. This is the story of how one night, at kilometer 110 on the highway to Mexico, Jose Luis encountered something he shouldn't have seen, and how that encounter haunted him for months, becoming his worst nightmare. Get ready, turn off the lights if you dare, and join me in this tale of the cursed bus driver. Jose Luis Hernandez Sanchez had been driving minibuses between towns and cities for 15 years. He knew every curve, every pothole, every dangerous stretch of those highways like the back of his hand. For him, the highway was his second home, his office, his entire life. He was a hardworking man, one of those who leave before dawn and return when night has already fallen. Father of 3 children, devoted husband, he never failed in his obligations. But there was something Jose Luis hated with all his soul: empty return trips. It was November 2nd of last year, Day of the Dead. Jose Luis had dropped off his last group of passengers at the Mexico terminal, around 9 at night. The return trip to his town would be long, lonely, and without a single vessel of profit. But that was the job. At least I'll get home by midnight and sleep in my bed, he thought as he started the engine of his old white minibus with red stripes, which he affectionately called the jalopy. The highway was strangely empty that night. Not a single car for miles. Only the yellowish glow of the jalopy's headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Jose Luis turned on the radio, but only found static. Strange. He normally picked up at least 3 or 4 stations on that stretch. Bah, must be the signal, he muttered, turning it off. Kilometer 95, 100, 105. Jose Luis yawned, took a sip from his thermos of already cold coffee, and lit a cigarette. The smoke swirled inside the cabin, dancing in the air currents coming through the half-opened window. And then he reached kilometer 110. At first, it was just a feeling. That tingling on the back of your neck that tells you something isn't right. Jose Luis looked in the rearview mirror without knowing why. The empty interior of the minibus stared back at him, the seats covered in shadows that danced with the movement. He turned his gaze forward, and then he saw them. In the distance, maybe 200 meters away, there were figures. People walking along the shoulder of the highway. Jose Luis counted quickly. 1, 2, 3. No, there were more. Maybe 5 or 6 figures moving slowly in the same direction he was driving. What the hell are they doing walking at this hour, he thought. It wasn't rare to find people on the highways sometimes. People who missed the last bus, families returning from visiting their deceased in the cemeteries during Day of the Dead. But something about these figures didn't add up. They were walking too slowly and too close together, like a procession. Jose Luis reduced his speed. His training as a driver told him he should be careful, that people on the highway at night were a danger. But something else, something primitive in his brain, screamed at him to accelerate and pass by. He ignored that second voice. At 100 meters away, Jose Luis could make out the figures better. They were 5, definitely. They wore dark clothing. or so it seemed. They walked hunched over, with slow and heavy steps. One of them, the one in front, seemed to be carrying something in his arms. A bundle? A child? Poor devils, Jose Luis muttered. I'll give them a ride to the next town. 50 meters. The minibus headlights bathed them in yellow light. Jose Luis gently pressed the brake, preparing to stop. But then something strange happened. The figures didn't turn to look at him. None of them reacted to the light from the headlights or the sounds of the approaching engine. They simply kept walking as if the minibus didn't exist. 30 meters. Hey, Jose Luis shouted out the window. Do you need help? Nothing. Not even a turned head. 20 meters. It was then that Jose Luis noticed something that made his stomach twist. The figures weren't casting shadows. Despite the powerful headlights of the minibus illuminating them directly, the pavement beneath them remained dark, without a single shadow indicating their presence. 10 meters. Jose Luis's hand trembled on the steering wheel. His foot froze between the accelerator and the brake. Part of him wanted to stop, help like any good Samaritan would. But another part, that primitive voice now screaming, ordered him to get away. 5 meters. Jose Luis could see them clearly now, and what he saw took his breath away. They had no faces. Where their faces should have been, there was only darkness. Not shadows, not features blurred by distance or light. Simply nothing. As if someone had erased their faces with a giant eraser. And their clothes. God, their clothes. They weren't dark as he had thought. They were soaked with something dark and viscous that dripped onto the pavement with each step. Panic took hold of Jose Luis. He floored the accelerator. The jalape's engine roared and the minibus shot forward. He passed by the figures in a second. And in that second, as he crossed next to them, Jose Luis turned his head to look at them one last time. It was a mistake. The 5 figures had stopped walking. Now they stood still, looking directly at the minibus. And although they had no faces, Jose Luis felt their eyes on him. He felt their cold, dead, hungry gaze penetrating through the metal and glass directly to his soul. And then, just as he was about to leave them behind, one of the figures, the one in front, the one carrying the bundle, slowly raised its hand and pointed directly at Jose Luis. Jose Luis screamed. He couldn't help it. A primitive scream of pure terror burst from his throat as he buried the accelerator all the way down. The speedometer marked 120, 130, 140 kilometers per hour. Dangerously fast for that winding highway, but Jose Luis didn't care. He just wanted to get away, put as much distance as possible between him and those things. He looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figures getting smaller and smaller in the distance. There was nothing. The highway behind him was completely empty, as if the figures had never existed. Jose Luis drove for 10 more kilometers before daring to reduce his speed. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the steering wheel. Sweat ran down his forehead and soaked his shirt. They weren't real, he told himself. I was just tired. I'd been driving for too many hours. It was my imagination. But deep in his heart, Jose Luis knew the truth. What he had seen at kilometer 110 was real. And something told him it wasn't done with him. Not yet. Jose Luis arrived home past 1 a.m. His wife, Maria, was waiting up for him as always, with dinner warming on the stove. But when she saw her husband walk in, pale and sweaty, with eyes like saucers, she knew something had happened. Jose, what happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost. How ironic, right? Jose Luis tried to tell her. He opened his mouth to explain what he had seen at kilometer 110, but the words got stuck in his throat. How do you explain something that defies all logic? How do you describe the terror he had felt seeing those faceless figures? It was a bad day, my love. I'm just tired. Maria looked at him with concern, but didn't insist. After 15 years of marriage, she knew when to press and when to give space. She hugged him, served him dinner, and sent him to bed. Jose Luis didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that faceless hand pointing at him. He felt those invisible eyes drilling into his soul. And worse still, he had the feeling, irrational but persistent, that something had returned with him from kilometer 110. The first few days after the incident, Jose Luis tried to convince himself that everything had been a product of fatigue and suggestion. It was Day of the Dead, after all. His mind had played with him, creating images from ghost stories he had heard all his life. But then the apparitions began. The first time was 3 days later, during his morning route. Jose Luis had picked up a group of passengers at the terminal, about 15 people in total. Everything was going normally. People chatted, some slept, others looked out the windows. Jose Luis drove on autopilot, his mind wandering on everyday worries. Then he heard a voice. "Excuse me, sir." Jose Luis looked in the rearview mirror toward the back seats. An elderly woman in the third row was signaling to him. He saw her clearly. Gray hair pulled back in a bun, flowered dress, a hand-knitted sweater. She was holding a shopping bag in her lap. "Yes, ma'am, what can I do for you?" "Can you tell me how much longer until we reach the town of San Miguel?" "About 20 minutes, ma'am." The woman nodded and went back to looking out the window. Jose Luis kept driving. 5 minutes later, he heard again. "Excuse me, sir." It was the same voice. Jose Luis looked in the mirror again, somewhat irritated, but what he saw made his blood freeze. The third well was empty, completely empty. Jose Luis braked abruptly, provoking complaints from the passengers. "Hey, be careful! What's wrong with you?" But Jose Luis didn't pay attention to them. With his heart racing, he got up from his seat and walked down the aisle to the third row. He touched the seat where he had seen the woman. It was freezing, so freezing that Jose Luis pulled his hand back with a hiss of pain, as if he had touched dry ice. "Sir, are you okay?" a passenger asked. "Did you see? Was there a lady sitting here? An elderly lady with a flowered dress?" The passenger looked at him like he was crazy. "No, sir. That row has been empty the whole trip." That was just the first one. During the following weeks, the apparitions became more frequent and more terrifying. Once, while driving at night, he saw in the rearview mirror that all the seats were occupied by dark figures, faceless, motionless, watching him. Jose Luis screamed and swerved, but when he looked again, the seats were empty as always. Another time, a small girl appeared sitting right behind him. She wore a dirty white dress and her long hair covered her face. Jose Luis didn't dare look at her directly, but he could see her out of the corner of his eye during the entire trip. When he finally reached the terminal and turned to confront her, he only found an empty seat and a small puddle of murky water where she should have been sitting. Passengers began to notice his erratic behavior. They complained that he braked for no reason, that he talked to himself, that he constantly looked toward the back seats with a terrified expression. "That driver is crazy," they commented. And maybe they were right. But it wasn't just on the minibus. The apparitions began to follow him home. The first time he saw something in his home, Jose Luis was brushing his teeth before bed. He looked in the bathroom mirror and saw, just behind him, reflected in the glass, one of the faceless figures from kilometer 110, standing, motionless, watching him. Jose Luis screamed and swerved, but when he looked again, the seats were empty as always. But from that night on, Jose Luis stopped using mirrors. The apparitions at home became part of his nightly routine. Sometimes it was a shadow crossing the hallway when everyone was asleep. Other times they were whispers in his ear just when he was about to fall asleep. Words he couldn't understand, but that filled his mind with inexplicable dread. One night, his youngest son, 7-year-old Carlitos, came running into his room crying. "Dad, Dad, there are people in my room, people with no faces, watching me." Those words were like a dagger in Jose Luis's heart. His son could see them too. Whatever he had brought from kilometer 110 wasn't just haunting him, but now stalked his family. That was the last straw.
Jose Luis began to investigate. He visited libraries, talked to village elders, consulted with healers and priests. He needed answers. He needed to know what he had seen at kilometer 110, and more importantly, how to get rid of it. It was Don Esteban, an elderly healer from the neighboring town, who finally gave him an explanation. At kilometer 110, the old man told him while sipping an herbal tea, many years ago, there was a terrible accident. A bus full of families returning from celebrating Day of the Dead went off the highway. It fell down a ravine. Everyone died. More than 30 people. Jose Luis felt a chill run down his spine. They say, Don Esteban continued, that those souls never found rest. They were trapped in that place, condemned to repeat their last journey for all eternity. They walk along the highway every Day of the Dead, looking for the bus that never came. But why are they haunting me? I had nothing to do with that accident. Don Esteban looked at him with wise and sad eyes. You saw them, boy, and they saw you. In the world of spirits, to be seen is to be connected. They marked you as a witness. And now, they believe you're the driver who should have taken them home. Jose Luis felt his legs fail him. He dropped into a chair, head in his hands. What can I do? They're tormenting my family. My son is seeing them. I can't live like this. Don Esteban remained silent for a long moment, thinking. Finally, he spoke. There is a way, but it won't be easy. You have to go back to kilometer 110. You must build an altar there, an offering for those lost souls. Flowers, candles, food, everything that's traditionally placed on Day of the Dead offerings. And you must ask their forgiveness for disturbing their rest. You must promise them that you will honor their memory. And that will work? If you're sincere, yes. Souls in torment only seek to be remembered, to be honored. If you give them that, they'll leave you in peace. Jose Luis nodded slowly. It was the only option he had. But there was a problem. The mere idea of returning to kilometer 110, of facing those faceless entities again, filled Jose Luis with paralyzing terror. Weeks passed while he gathered the necessary courage. Meanwhile, the apparitions got worse. One night, Jose Luis woke up and found all the faceless figures standing around his bed. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. He could only watch them as they watched him back with those non-existent eyes. One of them, the one that always pointed at him, leaned over him until its non-face was inches from his. And Jose Luis heard its voice, a voice that resonated not in his ears, but directly in his mind. Take us home. When he could finally move again, the sun was already rising and the figures had disappeared. But Jose Luis knew he had no time left. He had to act. That same afternoon, he prepared everything necessary for the offering. It was November 1st when José Luis finally gathered the courage to return to kilometer 110, eve of Day of the Dead, the same period in which his initial encounter had occurred. In the trunk of his old car, he refused to use the jalopy for this. José Luis loaded everything necessary for the altar: marigold flowers, candles of all colors, printed photographs of the accident victims he had found in old newspaper archives, pan de muerto, fruits, chocolate, and a bottle of tequila. Maria wanted to accompany him, but José Luis flatly refused. "No, my love, this is something I must do alone. It's my responsibility." She hugged him tightly with tears in her eyes. "Be careful and come back home. Your children need you. I need you." "I will. I promise." The trip to kilometer 110 was the longest of José Luis's life. Each kilometer seemed to stretch eternally. His heart beat so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands sweated on the steering wheel. Kilometer 100, 105, 108. When the kilometer 110 marker appeared in his vision, José Luis felt his entire body tense up. Slowly, carefully, he pulled his car to the shoulder and turned off the engine. The silence was absolute. There were no other cars on the highway, no birds singing in the nearby trees, not even wind. Only a heavy, unnatural silence that pressed against his eardrums. "Okay," he told himself. "You can do this. Just build the altar, say the words, and leave." With trembling hands, he took everything out of the trunk and began to work. José Luis built the altar directly on the shoulder, in the exact place where he had seen the figures that night. He spread a tablecloth over the grass, placed the photographs of the victims leaning against stones, surrounded everything with marigold flowers, lit the candles, and carefully arranged the food and drinks. The altar was beautiful, a worthy tribute to the lost souls. When he finished, José Luis kneeled in front of the offering. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and red. Soon it would be night. Soon it would be Day of the Dead. "Souls of kilometer 110, José Luis began with a trembling voice. "I come before you with humility and respect. Forgive me for having disturbed your rest that night. I didn't know. I didn't understand." The wind began to blow gently, moving the candle flames. "This altar is for you, to honor your memory, so you know you haven't been forgotten, that your lives mattered, that your families mourned you, and that your stories deserve to be remembered." The candle flames began to flicker more intensely, even though the wind had calmed. "Please," he felt tears run down his cheeks. "Leave me in peace. Leave my family in peace. We're not your enemy. We just want to live our lives. And I promise, I solemnly promise that every year on Day of the Dead, I will return here. I'll renew this altar. I'll remember you. Your names will not be forgotten." For a moment, nothing happened. José Luis remained kneeling with his eyes closed, waiting. For what? A sign? An attack? The end? And then he felt it. A presence. No, multiple presences surrounding him. José Luis slowly opened his eyes, terrified of what he might see. They were there. The 5 faceless figures stood in a semicircle around the altar,
so close that Jose Luis could have extended his hand and touched the nearest one. His first instinct was to run, scream, escape. But something kept him motionless, because this time it was different. The figures no longer emanated that aura of malevolence he had felt before. They were still terrifying, their absent faces, their clothes soaked with something dark. But there was something else, something that Jose Luis took a moment to identify. Sadness. These weren't malignant entities. They were lost souls, trapped, suffering. They just wanted to be remembered. They just wanted to go home. Slowly, maintaining eye contact, or where it should have been, with the central figure, the one that had always pointed at him, Jose Luis spoke again. "I'm sorry I can't take you home. I wish I could, but it's not in my power. The only thing I can offer you is my promise, the promise that you won't be forgotten, that every year someone will think of you, someone will honor your memory." The central figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering his words. Then slowly, it approached the altar. Jose Luis held his breath as he watched it extend its hand toward the flowers. It didn't touch them. It couldn't. But it passed its hand over them, as if caressing them. And to Jose Luis's amazement, the flowers reacted to it. They leaned slightly toward the figure, as if they could sense its presence. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, the 5 figures began to change. The darkness covering them began to dissipate like fog under the sun. And Jose Luis could see, for the first time, their true faces. A young man with a mustache, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, an old man with deep wrinkles, a teenage girl with braided hair, and a small child, the bundle that the first figure had always carried, no more than 5 years old. Real people, real lives that had been cut short too soon. The young man, the one that had always pointed at him, looked directly at Jose Luis, and for the first time since that terrible night, Jose Luis saw understanding in those eyes. He saw forgiveness. The man nodded once, and then, like smoke dispersing in the wind, the 5 figures began to fade, not abruptly or terrifyingly, gently, peacefully, as if finally, after decades of waiting, they could rest. Jose Luis watched until the last trace of their presence disappeared into the evening air. He remained kneeling in front of the altar for a long time afterwards, crying silently, crying for those lost souls, crying for the terror he had experienced, crying with relief because it was finally over. When he finally stood up, the stars were already shining in the night sky. Jose Luis looked at the altar one last time. "Rest in peace," he whispered. "I'll see you next year." And with that, he returned to his car and drove home. That night, Jose Luis slept for the first time in months without nightmares, without apparitions, without whispers in the darkness. He woke up with the sun shining through the window and his wife cuddled against him. Everything seemed brighter, warmer, more real than it had been in a long time. "Jose?" Maria woke up and looked at him. "You look different." "I feel different," he smiled. "It's over, my love. It's finally over." He didn't have to explain more. Maria understood. After months of seeing him suffer, of seeing the shadows under his eyes and the constant fear in his gaze, she immediately recognized the peace that now dwelt in him. "Thank God," she whispered, hugging him tightly. When Jose Luis returned to work, everything had changed. The jalopy no longer felt like a haunted place. It was just an old minibus with worn seats and an engine that needed repair, nothing more. Passengers no longer looked at him with distrust. They no longer complained about his erratic driving, because there wasn't any anymore. Jose Luis had recovered his professionalism, his confidence. But more than that, he had gained something new, a deep appreciation for life. Every passenger who got on his minibus was a blessing. Every trip successfully completed was a victory. Because Jose Luis knew, in a way few could understand, how fragile the line between life and death was. How easy it was to cross to the other side and get trapped like those poor souls at kilometer 110. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Jose Luis's life returned to normal. Well, almost to normal. Because now, every time he passed kilometer 110 during his routes, and he did it at least 3 times a week, Jose Luis slowed down slightly. Not much, just enough to look toward the shoulder where he had built the altar. The original flowers had wilted, of course, the candles had been consumed, but Jose Luis noticed something extraordinary. Other people had begun to leave their own offerings. Someone had placed fresh flowers, another had left a lit candle. A small handwritten note hung from a nearby tree. For the lost souls of kilometer 110, we don't forget you. Word had spread in the town and neighboring communities. The story of the accident, forgotten for decades, had been revived. The families of the victims, those who still lived, had been informed about the altar. And they came to visit it, to mourn their loved ones, to finally have a place to say goodbye. Jose Luis had done more than free those souls. He had given them back their names, their stories, their dignity. His son Carlitos no longer saw faceless figures in his room. Now he slept soundly every night, with dreams of superheroes and dinosaurs like any 7-year-old boy. Maria had stopped worrying every time Jose Luis left for work. The constant terror she had lived for months, the fear that her husband wouldn't return, or worse, that he would return as a shadow of himself, had been replaced by tranquility. The Hernandez family had survived the storm, and they had come out stronger on the other side. A year later, Day of the Dead arrived again. Jose Luis had marked the date on his calendar in advance. He had bought fresh flowers, no candles, freshly baked pan de muerto. This time, Maria insisted on accompanying him. "I want to know the place," she told him. "I want to thank those souls for letting you return to us." Together, they drove to kilometer 110 at sunset. Jose Luis was surprised to see they weren't alone. At least a dozen people had gathered around the altar, now much larger and more elaborate than the one he had originally built. They were relatives of the victims, curious people from town, other drivers who had heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. "Are you Jose Luis Hernandez?" asked an elderly woman, with tears in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. My brother died in that accident. Gilberto Sanchez, he was 23 years old." She pointed to one of the photographs on the altar, the young man with the mustache. "For 40 years, I didn't have a place to mourn him. The police never let us approach the ravine. And then, over time, everyone seemed to forget the accident had happened." The woman took Jose Luis's hands in hers. "Thank you. Thank you for giving him back his name, for giving me a place to remember him." Jose Luis felt a lump in his throat. He didn't trust his voice to respond, so he simply nodded and squeezed the woman's hands. That night, as the group gathered around the altar under the light of dozens of candles, Jose Luis felt something. A soft, almost imperceptible presence. Not terrifying like before. Comforting. He looked toward the edge of the candlelight, where the darkness of night began. And there, barely visible, he saw 5 silhouettes. But these were different. They weren't the dark, faceless figures that had haunted him. They were transparent, luminous, peaceful. The young man, Roberto Sanchez,
looked directly at him. And for the first time in this entire terrible ordeal, Jose Luis saw something on that face he hadn't seen before. A smile. The spirit raised its hand, not pointing this time, but in a gesture of farewell, of gratitude, of final peace. The other 4 spirits did the same. And then, as the family sang and prayed and cried, the 5 figures faded into the candlelight. This time, Jose Luis knew it was forever. They had found their way home.
2 years have passed since that night at kilometer 110. Jose Luis continues driving his minibus, although the jalopy was finally replaced by a newer model, traveling the same highways he has known for almost 2 decades. But something fundamental changed in him. He no longer sees his work as just a means to earn money. He sees it as a sacred service. Every passenger he takes from one place to another is a precious life, a story in development. And his responsibility is to make sure everyone gets home safe and sound. The altar at kilometer 110 has become a place of pilgrimage, especially during Day of the Dead, when dozens of people gather there to honor not only the victims of that specific accident, but all those who have lost their lives on Mexico's highways. There's a plaque now installed by the local government. It says, "In memory of the 32 souls lost on November 2, 1983. May their memory teach us to value every journey, every moment, every life." Jose Luis Hernandez Sanchez continues driving, continues living, continues remembering. And on quiet nights when he passes kilometer 110, sometimes, just sometimes, he thinks he sees 5 luminous figures at the edge of the highway. Not walking lost like before, but simply standing, watching, protecting the travelers who pass, guarding their stretch of highway. Finally, at peace. And so ends the story of our subscriber, Jose Luis Hernandez Sanchez. A story that reminds us that not all ghosts are malignant. Sometimes they're simply lost souls who need to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. I want to thank Jose Luis for having the courage to share his experience with us. I know it wasn't easy to relive those terrifying moments, but his story has taught us something valuable about respect, compassion, and the power of memory. And now, dear subscribers, it's your turn. Do you have a story to tell? Have you experienced something inexplicable, terrifying, or just strange? Have you seen something on the highway, in your home, at your work, that you can't forget? I invite you to send me your stories. They can be long or short, recent or from years ago. All stories deserve to be heard. All mysteries deserve to be shared. You can send your experiences through the comments down below or send me a direct message. Don't forget to include your names or a pseudonym if you prefer to remain anonymous, and specific details that make your story unique. The best stories will be featured here on the channel, so thousands of people can hear what happened to you. Your experience could help someone else who is going through something similar. Or it could simply remind us all that we live in a much more mysterious world than we believe. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video. Share it with your friends who enjoy horror stories. And of course, if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you don't miss any future stories. Remember, every like, every comment, every subscription helps us keep bringing you the most chilling stories from Mexico and the world. See you in the next video, dear subscribers. Until then, take care. Drive carefully. And if you ever pass through kilometer 110 on the highway to Mexico Ciudad, slow down. Look at the altar. And remember the souls that rest there. Because we never know when we ourselves might become travelers who need to be remembered. Good night, and may you have sweet dreams.